In the heart of West Africa, where the red dust meets the golden sun, a revolution was born. Not a revolution of guns and power, but of courage, faith, and dignity. This is the story of a soldier who became the voice of his people. His name, Ibrahim Traoré. Ibrahim Traoré, a name now whispered with respect across Africa, was not born into power. He was born into struggle, in the small town of Bondoukoui, Burkina Faso. A simple child from a humble Muslim family, raised with discipline, faith, and love for his country. From a young age, he watched his people suffer: hunger, corruption, terrorism, and hopelessness. He saw the faces of children who couldn't go to school because war had taken everything. That's when a dream was born inside him, to fight not for fame, but for freedom. As a teenager, Ibrahim joined the Burkinabe army. He trained under harsh conditions, surviving heat, dust, and exhaustion. He wasn't the strongest, but he was the most determined. He quickly became known for his intelligence, honesty, and courage on the battlefield. When terrorist attacks increased in northern Burkina Faso, Traoré volunteered to go, not once, not twice, but every time his country needed him. He fought alongside his brothers, often leading missions deep into danger zones. He wasn't just giving orders, he was leading from the front. In the army, his leadership style was simple, greater than, "If my men are hungry, I will not eat. If they are cold, I will not rest. We win together, or we die together." Those words spread like wildfire among soldiers. Burkina Faso, once known as the land of honest men, had fallen into chaos. Terrorists controlled villages, people were fleeing their homes, and hope was dying. Corruption infected every level of government. Foreign powers exploited the country's gold and resources while its people starved. Traoré began to see that the problem was not just the terrorists. It was the system itself, a system built to keep Burkina Faso weak. He watched as leaders made promises but delivered nothing. He saw the foreign influence tightening its grip, France, the UN, and multinational corporations all acting in support, but gaining control. The young captain began to ask dangerous questions. Why are we still poor in a land full of gold? Why do we depend on outsiders to defend our home? And why do our leaders serve others instead of their own people? Those questions would soon make him a threat. On September 30th, 2022, everything changed. Burkina Faso woke up to the news. A new leader had taken charge. At just 34 years old, Captain Ibrahim Traoré led a peaceful military takeover, not for greed, but for sovereignty. He declared that Burkina Faso would no longer be controlled by outsiders. He stood on national TV, wearing his camouflage uniform, and said, "We are tired of seeing our mothers cry. We are tired of burying our brothers. Burkina Faso will be free, or it will fall with honor." Crowds flooded the streets. People chanted his name, "Traoré, Traoré, our lion." He became the youngest president in the world, but his message was ancient, greater than "Africa must stand up again." He cut ties with colonial powers and sought unity with other African nations. He allied with Mali and Niger, forming a new regional vision of independence, the Sahel Alliance. He refused to bow to the IMF, the UN, or France. Instead, he called for African unity, dignity, and control over their own natural resources. But every revolution faces storms. Traoré's government came under pressure: economic sanctions, political sabotage, foreign propaganda. They tried to paint him as a dictator, as anti-Western, but he never stopped speaking for the people. In villages, old women prayed for him. Children carried his photo, calling him our hero. Young Africans across the continent began wearing shirts with his face, saying, "We are all Traoré." He launched programs for agriculture, education, and youth training. He pushed soldiers to protect borders without foreign troops. And slowly, the people began to believe again. But he always reminded them, "This is not about me. It's about our people, our land, our freedom. Now Ibrahim Traoré stands as a symbol of a new Africa, an Africa that no longer wants pity, but respect. An Africa that refuses to kneel. His story is still being written. Every day, every speech, every act of courage adds another chapter. But one thing is certain, even if he falls, his message will not die. Greater than, we were born free, and we will die free. And when the history of modern Africa is told, the name Ibrahim Traoré will echo among the greatest, a soldier who became a symbol, a man who awakened a nation, and a leader who dared to say no when others stayed silent. The days after the revolution were not easy. Burkina Faso was free in spirit, but the scars of the past still bled. Villages destroyed by terrorism, farmers afraid to plant seeds, mothers crying for sons who never returned. And yet, a new heartbeat began to echo through the land. Everywhere Traoré went, crowds gathered, barefoot children, old warriors, young dreamers. They shouted one word, dignity. He didn't hide behind walls or luxury cars. He walked among his people, shook hands with farmers, and sat with soldiers under the scorching sun. He listened, truly listened, to their stories. And every time someone told him, "We have nothing left," he would reply, "No. You still have your land, your courage, and your pride." That is enough to rebuild a nation. But behind that courage, Traoré knew the truth. He was fighting a silent war. Foreign media began their attacks, headlines calling him dangerous, dictator, anti-democracy. They feared his voice, because his voice was waking up all of Africa. Across the world, whispers began in secret rooms, powerful men discussing the young captain who dared to challenge the system. He had become more than a leader. He was now a symbol, and symbols are dangerous. Economic sanctions hit Burkina Faso. Aid was frozen, supplies stopped. But instead of breaking, Traoré turned to his people and said, "If they cut off our aid, we will feed ourselves. If they close their doors, we will build our own." He encouraged local industries. Farmers began to trade directly with neighbors, gold miners formed local cooperatives, and small businesses flourished. He launched the Made in Burkina campaign, reminding everyone, greater than, we do not need the world's permission to stand tall. In schools, children began to learn about Africa's real heroes. Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, Nelson Mandela, and now Ibrahim Traoré. Their spirits blended into one, a single flame of African unity. Meanwhile, Mali and Niger joined hands with Burkina Faso. Together, they created the Alliance of Sahel States, a new chapter of independence. No longer begging the West for protection, they built their own defense, trained their own youth, and declared, "We will protect our land, our gold, and our people by ourselves." Behind the speeches and strength, there was still a man, young, humble, and deeply spiritual. Late at night, when the city slept, Traoré would sit alone in silence. He would read, pray, and write in his notebook, thoughts that no camera ever captured. He often remembered his childhood, the dusty streets of Bondoki, his mother's prayers, his father's wisdom. He once said to a close friend, "If I ever forget where I came from, then I don't deserve where I am." His simplicity amazed everyone. He lived without luxury, no expensive cars, no golden palaces. His salary was modest. He said, "If the people are poor, I have no right to live rich." Even his guards said they often found him sitting on the ground, eating with soldiers, laughing with children. It wasn't an act. It was who he truly was. Across Africa, something extraordinary began to happen. In Senegal, in Chad, in Congo, young people started holding Traoré's picture during protests. They weren't following a man, they were following an idea. The idea that Africa could be united, strong, and free again. Social media exploded with his speeches, his quotes, his courage. Millions of Africans started saying, "We are not poor. We are robbed. We are not weak, we are divided. And everywhere, his words gave them strength. He once stood before a crowd of students and said, "They say Africa needs to catch up with the world. I say, the world must catch up with Africa's heart." His dream was bigger than Burkina Faso. He saw a future where Africa would build its own technology, heal its own people, and feed its own children. A future where Africans would no longer run away, but stay and rise. Today, Ibrahim Traoré continues his fight, not with guns, but with vision. He faces pressure, threats, and endless challenges, but his resolve remains unbroken. In one of his speeches, he said, "They will not understand us now. They will call us rebels, radicals, or fools. But one day, when our children walk freely on their own land, they will know. We were the ones who refused to kneel." His story is far from over. And maybe that's the beauty of it. Because true leaders don't seek to finish their own story. They light the path for others to continue it. It was not an easy fight. Terrorist groups continued their attacks, villages burned, families were displaced. Each night, the list of names of those who had died grew longer, and yet Ibrahim refused to surrender to despair. He traveled to the front lines, he visited the wounded, he listened to the mothers who had lost their sons. He did what so many leaders before him had failed to do. He stood with his people in their darkest moments. And so, his people gave him something more valuable than riches or power. They gave him their trust. They believed him when he said that their suffering was not in vain, that together they could rise. And slowly, that trust spread beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa, young people began to see Ibrahim as a mirror of their own dreams. In crowded city streets, in dusty villages, in universities and marketplaces, his name was spoken with hope. He became a symbol of resistance not only to terrorism, but to the legacy of colonialism that still haunted Africa. Ibrahim declared openly that Africa could not remain forever under the shadow of others, that it must stand on its own feet, build its own future, and write its own story. And in those words, millions across the continent heard an echo of something they had long desired but rarely heard from their leaders: courage. The more he spoke, the more people listened. The more he acted, the more they believed. And so, the title grew louder, not from his own mouth, but from the people themselves. They called him the people's hero, because to them, he was not just a president or a soldier. He was a living reminder that hope was still possible. But heroes are never without enemies. And as Ibrahim's star began to rise, powerful nations grew restless. They feared that his voice, young as it was, would inspire others across Africa to demand the same freedom, the same dignity, the same independence. They feared that Africa would no longer bow, and so they plotted, they schemed, they prepared to test him. Yet Ibrahim was ready, for he was not alone. Behind him stood millions of hearts that beat with the same dream. And that is something no empire, no army, no propaganda can ever destroy. As the young captain-turned-leader stood firm, the world watched with unease. In foreign capitals, men in suits whispered about him. They said he was dangerous, not because he had great weapons or vast riches, but because he had awakened something more powerful than either of them those: the spirit of a people. Newspapers in Europe wrote articles filled with doubt. Analysts on television spoke of instability. Governments released statements questioning his legitimacy. But for the ordinary people of Africa, Ibrahim Traoré's name spread like fire in the dry season. For them, he was not just a leader of Burkina Faso. He was the voice they wished their own leaders would have. In Mali, in Niger, in Guinea, in Ghana, young men painted his face on walls. They wrote his words on banners. They lifted his image in rallies, saying, "Here is a leader who speaks for us all." For decades, Africa had been told to stay silent, to follow, to obey. But now, here was a leader who said, "No, we will walk on our own feet. We will decide our own future." The people's hero was becoming Africa's hero. But this path was not without risk. Powerful nations did not take kindly to the voice of resistance. Economic sanctions began to tighten, aid was cut, and diplomatic pressure grew heavier by the day. They thought this would break him. They thought this would turn his people against him. Yet, they underestimated the bond between Ibrahim and his nation. For every sanction that came, his people gave more. Farmers shared their harvests with soldiers. Traders in the markets lowered their prices for families in need. Volunteers organized to defend their neighborhoods. It was as if an invisible thread tied every citizen to their leader. In his struggle, they saw their own struggle. In his courage, they found their own. And Ibrahim did not disappoint them. He spoke boldly, declaring that Africa's future could no longer be dictated by outsiders. He said that Africa was rich not only in gold, in cotton, in land, but rich in its people, in its culture, in its history. He reminded his people that freedom was not given, it was taken. And his words carried across borders, into homes, into schools, into the hearts of millions.